Hello everybody, welcome back to another virtual makers club. Last week we did a video on knitting basics, how to cast on, how to knit, and how to purl. And this week we're going to look into using a knitting loom. Now knitting looms come in a bunch of different sizes. Today I'm going to be using a small one because it's easier to show you. It doesn't take so long to go around. Knitting on a knitting loom is quite a bit easier than your standard knitting with, 2 needles or 4 needles or circular needles. However, it's a lot more limiting. You can only make something that is this size. Really, there are some other things you can do with a knitting loom, but basically you're limited to the size of the loom that you have. So like, for example, you can't make a hat on this. Unless you're like making a hat for a doll or something like that, but this size is definitely too small for that. So it is a bit limiting in that regard. I'm just going to show you on this the basics of how to knit on the loom. It's very fast. It's very simple. You only need your loom. You need some kind of hook, a needle that has a hook on the end, because this is going to help you. You'll see the loom has these little indentations, so you use the hook to be able to bring the yarn up and over. And then you need a yarn needle, your yarn, of course, and some scissors. Now, what size yarn you use will determine what your project looks like. The thicker the yarn that you use, and this yarn is pretty thick, you are going to have a more tightly woven project. Whereas if you were to use very, very thin yarn like this, if you were to use a yarn this thin on here, you would have a lot of, it would look very like loose, almost kind of lacy, which is fine if that's the look you're going for. Otherwise, you want to use a thicker yarn. So the first thing we're going to do, I'm going to unravel some of my yarn here. Okay, we're going to get started by creating a slip knot. And if you remember from the last video, the slip knot is created by making a loop with the yarn. And now we have our working yarn, which is the yarn that's still attached to the skein, is behind the loop. We're going to take that and put it through and then tighten. And then we're just going to put it on this peg right here. And this will help keep it out of the way for the first couple rounds. Now we're going to start wrapping around. You want to go around behind the peg and then in front. Okay, so you're always going the same way. You're always going behind the peg, and it helps if you push down as you go, because there's going to be 2 loops on each peg, and you want to make sure that you have enough room to get the one loop over the other. Okay, so we finished our first row. Now we're going to do the same thing. We're going to go behind and around so that we have 2 loops on each pole, and that is how you start a project on a loom. Okay, and that's it. And then we're going to take our working yarn and hold it right down here with our starting yarn. And that is how you start any project on a knitting loom. So each peg has 2 pieces of yarn on it, 2 loops. And then what you want to do is you want to use your tool to get that bottom loop over the top. And you don't want to wrap too tight like I did, or you're going to have trouble getting that loop over the peg. So you want to wrap relatively loosely so that you don't have a lot of trouble. And again, pull down as you go along. So we're just taking the bottom loop. We're using that little track on the peg to help get our tool up and over the top loop. And then pushing down. Okay, so I've done another row, and now I'm going to show you how to cast off your project. Obviously, whatever project you're doing is going to require more than 2 rows, and there's also some other techniques that you can use while creating what you're creating with your loom knitting. Like, for example, you can make, if you're making a hat, you could make a brim to the hat, and that's done by taking the very end of your yarn, like your first row, and bringing it up over so that you have your second loop, and then taking the bottom loop and putting it over the top, and you do that for the whole row. So that's something you could do to make like a brim of a hat. You don't have to do that. I think it makes it look a little bit more neater, a little bit more neat, sorry. And then you can pretty much do a couple different things like that. So if you like went to YouTube, or if you went on even like one of our resources like Creative Bug, or borrowed an ebook, you can find out all the different things that you can use in Knitting Loom for. This is just like the absolute basics. So now I'm going to show you how to cast off your project. Now, if you're making a hat, you're still going to cast off the same way, but in the end, you're going to pull it really tight like a drawstring, and it'll cinch the top. There still might be like a little hole at the top of your hat, but for the most part, it'll be close. It'll look like a regular hat. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my working yarn and I'm going to cut it off. And I'm also going to trim this bottom part here. Get that out of the way. And then I'm going to take a piece of yarn and I'm going to thread it through my yarn needle. Now this yarn is pretty thick, so it might be kind of hard to get it through my yarn needle. Okay, it was tough, but it got through. So now what you do to finish your project is you're going to take the yarn needle with your yarn on it. You're going to thread it through, and you're not going to pull it all the way through, but now you're going to take this loop and you're going to bring it over the top. And you're going to do the same thing to your next one. Make sure you don't pull the yarn needle all the way through, and also make sure you're not going to get caught on any pegs. You can see we have a little bit of a confusing mess here. There we go. It's a little bit confusing to see what you're doing at the beginning because you have your end yarn, you also have the end of your working yarn. That should get a bit easier now. So we still got our needle, we're not pulling all the way through. We're going underneath, and then we're pulling over. And this is going to help you cast off without losing any loops. Again, be careful your yarn doesn't get caught on any pegs along the way. And you don't want to pull too hard yet, because then it's going to start closing your project. All right, so this is our last peg here. We're going to take this up and over. We're going to untie from there. And then as you can see, our project is completely off the loom. Now you're going to have basically 4 pieces of yarn dangling. So this was the end of our project before we cut off the yarn. This was the beginning of our project, which if you're working on a larger project on a larger loom, eventually you're going to have to actually untie this from the peg because it's going to start to yank the project down with it. But since I only made a very small little piece here, it never got to that point. And then you have your 2 parts of the yarn that you use to cast off. Now you have 2 choices here. If you wanted your, I'm just going to take my yarn needle off. If you wanted your project to just stay circular like that, like if you're making a wristband or something like that, a hair tie or whatever, you could just leave it like this. But if you were going to make a hat, what you would want to do is you'd want to take these 2 pieces of yarn and cinch them. So you're holding your project and you're holding these 2 pieces of yarn and you're just going to pull. And you can see how that makes the top nice and tight. So if you're making a hat, you would do that obviously on a larger scale. It would cinch it, and then you'd have your hat coming down, and this would be the very, very top of your hat. And you'd want to make sure you tie that really, really tight. Otherwise, you're going to have a hole. And then you would just use your yarn needle again to weave your loose ends. You want to trim them down as much as you can, and then use your yarn needle to weave the loose ends in. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to just tie these together gently so that I don't cinch the project. Make a nice double knot. And then I'm going to trim the ends off. And then, like I said, you can use your yarn needle to weave these in, or what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to tie a knot around one of my loops, tie it nice and tight, and trim that. And I'm going to do the same here. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to wrap it around a loop. That way it doesn't come loose. And now I'm just going to tie it in a knot. Whoops. And trim. And there you go. And that is the very basics of loom knitting. Of course, like I said, looms come in a bunch of different shapes and sizes. You can even buy kits where you can create your own loom pattern and sizes, and they come with different size pegs, and you can use that for different projects. You can use looms to make scarves, mittens, hats, pretty much anything you want. It is a little bit, like I said, a little bit more limiting than regular knitting, so I guess I shouldn't say you can make anything you want, but there is a lot more than you can make than just a circular project. So make sure you check out other YouTube videos. You could check out our resources like Creative Bug or some of our ebooks online through Libby and learn a little bit more about loom knitting. And if you try it yourself, let us know. You can tag us on Instagram at EBP Library Kids, or you can upload it to our Maker Club Padlet. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Bye.